Be here now. Just be here now.
Welcome to the Road Home podcast with Ethan Nichtern. Join Ethan as he and his guests explore the Buddhist path as it relates to art, culture, activism, politics, Western psychology, and more. If you'd like to support Ethan's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Ethan.
So, hi everyone. This is Ethan Nichtern. Welcome back to the Road Home podcast. I'm here with somebody I've known in the social media verse and read two of his books for grown-ups and for kids. And we're meeting for the first time. I guess this is in real life, Zoom, but author, teacher, surfer, Jaimal Yogis. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Ethan. It's great to finally see you. Yeah, this does feel like the real world for these days. It's like there's this world, and then there's the Matrix out there of reality.
Yes, I haven't seen the new Matrix movie, so I don't know if it's worth it.
I haven't either. No, I'm curious. It was such a that was the first big Dharma movie of our growing up, and so it'd be interesting to see where they went with it.
So I may need a better first question, but I always ask people because I think it's just kind of revelatory to talk about how they got their sort of origin story with meditation, mindfulness, Dharma, Buddhism, if they're a Buddhist person. So how did you get into all this?
I'm a Dharma baby like you. My parents were into it. My mom was kind of half Jewish, but really related to the Jewish side of her upbringing, but was really raised like agnostic, kind of scientific, sort of. And she, got into various forms of yoga and met my dad, who was in the military, who was also kind of raised Catholic, but not in any serious way. But they both had kind of those Judeo-Christian backgrounds, typical 60s kind of attraction to some of the teachers that were floating around. They studied under a teacher named Sanchi, fairly seriously, who is a Sikh. And that's actually how I got my name, Jaimal. Baba Jaimal Singh was the teacher's teacher of Sanchi in that Sikh lineage. But then as they kind of waxed and waned in their own practice, there was always some yoga and stuff going on in my house. And meditation. And then they got more into mindfulness and Buddhism. I feel like as that was kind of picking up steam with I remember going to my first mindfulness class as a teenager with my mom. It was so, it was around, but I actually didn't really get it. I was kind of oh, whatever, that's the stuff my parents do. And they're totally crazy and they had a big divorce and, it wasn't oh, that's what I'm going to do, but I was exposed to it. And what ended up happening was I grew up in Sacramento, but I had been on the islands in the Azores. I'm sorry, this is so long-winded. When my dad was stationed in the military there as from 3 to 6 years old. So the ocean was a big part of our lives, and my dad had been a surfer. So long story short, as I was in a typical big public high school popularity contest, crazy high school experience in Sacramento, and both loving that in some ways and completely frustrated by it. I was getting into lots of trouble. I had gotten a DUI and was smoking weed in school and had gotten in a series of trouble where I was on probation for my DUI. I was basically like an ordinary kid I was always the one to get caught. And, but I felt like my world was ending and that I was really a big screw up. And I ran away from home to Maui when I was 16. It was only like a 3-week trip, but while I was there, I had no money. My whole intention was to learn to surf and to change my life radically, and live outside of the suburban doldrums. And while I was there, it was really hard. I was like eating cans of beans and figuring out how to live. And I started meditating. I picked up like a Thich Nhat Hanh book, and while I was learning to surf, started trying to teach myself how to meditate, like under a tree on the North Shore of Maui, and was terrible at it and was a terrible surfer. But I think because they were learned together, I instantly made this connection between like waves of thought in the mind and waves in the ocean. And so that's been a theme for me in my writing and in my practice, here, like I am 30 years later or whatever.
So your first book, yeah,
20.
You're we can be older than we are,
Feels like 30 years ago.
Yeah, I'm not rushing to get older anymore. That when I turned 40, that stopped. But
I hear you.
So I'm not a surfer, but it's fascinating to me. Like Saltwater Buddha, your first book. It does seem to be an incredibly meditative sport in general. And my best friend from college, still one of my 2 or 3 best friends in the world, became a documentary filmmaker and made a movie called Momentum Generation about all the camaraderie of surfing around all the young American surfers who moved to Hawaii and became this whole generation of world championship surfers. So it does strike me as like a meditator's sport or activity. So was that just an instantaneous connection? I mean,
I did kind of have, there's been this like vibe around surfing, I think, from the beginning. I think it being an ancient sport, the Hawaiian spirituality has a lot of overlap with Buddhism and Taoism, especially, just sort of like, let nature be, let it flow and let it flow through you. So I think that is there. And then Jerry Lopez was like this, iconic surfer, pipeline surfer, who was in the 70s. There's a famous movie called Chasing the Lotus that has him like in full lotus on the cover. And so there was kind of this like, well, surfers are alternative, and Buddhism is alternative. And I think because even though it is a competitive sport, it's basically you out there with the elements. And most people don't do it competitively. Most people do it in this way where it's like you hike or like you mountain climb or like you ski, where it's about being in nature. So there's a lot of meditative elements. And I think the fact that you're alone and then there's this goal to catch a wave, but a lot of the time is spent waiting for a wave. So you're kind of alone with your breath like that, or alone with your thoughts. And there's a patience element. And then there's this other deeper level where it's like, well, you're riding waves, and waves are kind of like the building blocks of reality in some ways. And our experiences come in waves. We talk, we're very like aqua creatures. That wasn't the most eloquent way to put it, but we're made of water. Our brains are basically mostly water. Our blood is very close to the consistency of seawater. So we speak a lot in water terms, like, I'm drowning in work. I'm in the flow. And so I think there's just a lot of intuitive connections between surfing and spiritual practice or meditation practice. And So for me, it was kind of, I did have this feeling, and I think it's why I ran away, that if I could build my life around surfing, it would be like a wholesome, beautiful, profound life. Even before I surfed, I was just like, if I can do that, that will just be. And, there's all these sort of aspects of surfing that have nothing to do with anything profound or spiritual or meditative. But it's all how I had certainly felt that when I was dreaming about a surf life. And I think it really is true. It's like anything though. It's like the intention you bring to it. You can make bowling your meditation practice, or, underwater basket weaving. But with surfing, it's like there is something where the intuitive connection is already there.
Yeah. Yeah. And also the other part of it that feels super meditative to me, which is I think you do a really good job, especially in your children's book of kind of demonstrating this, the notion of not being in control of the elements, right? There's a lot of sports that you can play where you never have total control, but if you're playing tennis, how your racket is strung. You have a basic sense. Maybe there's wind one day, maybe you're playing on different surfaces, but more or less the court is fairly stable. Whereas, with surfing, you don't know what the ocean is going to throw at you, and that's a hard cliche to get people over in their meditation practice. Like, what thoughts or emotions move through your mind on a given day, you actually have no control over. It is very water-like. It is very elemental, sometimes smooth, sometimes choppy, and we don't always know why, right? So that's sort of that aspect of being you're not even in a playing field on a certain level. You're just you're in the ocean.
No, there's a lot of convenient metaphors, and almost sometimes I feel like they're too convenient. Like as a teacher, this, we're always reaching for a writer. You're reaching for metaphors that work, and sometimes I feel like I've trapped myself in forever making surfing meditation.
I know.
But there are other ways to look at this, but no, there are some really helpful ones. I think in that. The ocean is always beautiful. It's like whether it's stormy or whether it's calm. And it's like, if you can take that perspective about your mind where, okay, I woke up today and I'm stormy, but that's a natural thing. Like that happens. And, I haven't always been stormy. I've been calm some days. I've been sort of like beautifully serene, but with really great ideas coming every once in a while, like sharp, but with energy. I've been totally placid. These are passing states. And if I can sort of not identify so much with them, like this is my fault, why am I stormy? Or why can't I generate an idea today? I'm so flat or whatever. It's like, those are just ways that our minds change, and we're part of this larger substratum. And so when you sit, at least to kind of take a step back and be like, how is my mind, and not judge it. And if you do that, like you're checking the waves, it's like, I don't get angry at the ocean if I might feel a little frustrated if the waves aren't good, but I'm not identifying with that or saying it's the ocean's fault, So
yeah,
there's a lot there. And then when you're riding a wave or when you're in the ocean, there's this cool emotional metaphor that happens. Like when you get beaten down by a wave, most people know this just from swimming in the ocean, like whether you're a surfer or not, you have no power to beat the ocean. Like once the wave crashes, it's going to hold you down for as long as it wants to. So you might as well relax and then let the wave pass, and then you come up for air. If when the wave crushes you down, you fight it, you end up using a lot of energy and you're not stronger than the ocean. So it's kind of like when you've been hit by a really heavy emotion, like fear or sadness or guilt or jealousy or something, and you find yourself struggling against that emotion, it's almost like you're just adding, insult to injury. But if you kind of are like, take the mindful approach of, all right, here it is, it's got me. Relax, it's going to pass, and not react to the emotion. And that's a really helpful surfing metaphor that I still come back to on like a daily basis,
Yeah. I wonder if you'll allow me to trip out a little bit philosophically for a moment. One thing I've been contemplating recently, I'm just coming from kind of a lot of aspects of, Tibetan, more indigenous kind of worldview that sort of underrides their approach to the Dharma. I've been finishing this book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass, who's a indigenous scientist and professor and botanist. And one of the sort of philosophical debates or view differences that she brings out a lot is the notion of scientific materialism versus animism, right? The idea, and have had, various recent conversations on the podcast about this, the idea that there's nothing that isn't alive, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I want to talk about kids stuff too. And one of my daughter's favorite movies, which is one of the things she makes me watch too many times, is Moana, the Disney movie. And in that movie, like the ocean is it's animated by gods and goddesses, right? And it's a living being that has entity and sort of consciousness too. So I wonder, do you take that, like, is the water alive? Do you have a view on this?
I do. I mean, I'm definitely, I would say my most profound, like those moments that you bookmark when you're on retreat, where you're just like, holy crap, something just happened that was like broke open and just affirmed why I do this whole thing, involve basically feeling like every single thing around me is alive. And one of them, it was really like a precursor to a meditative experience, happened. I write about it in Saltwater Buddha, actually, where I was out at this spot on the Big Island that's kind of dangerous, and I'd been working my way up to like getting up the courage to go, and I got comfortable there, and then one day went alone without the friend who introduced it to me, and was really had a lot of shakiness. Long story short, this other guy paddled out who was all scarred up and a little bit like not, we would say not in his right mind. He was just kind of looked like he'd been through a lot. And he explained to me how he reads dragons in the clouds. And that's how he knows the weather. And at any rate, the conversation got me thinking like, oh, rather than judging this guy, what if I sort of like opened up to his worldview of like this animistic kind of, like maybe there are dragons out there in the clouds. This was also a segue into how my dragon book eventually came to be, but it was this experience where all of a sudden the water really felt alive to me, and not just that, but like the lava, and in a visceral way where you're just like, that kind of portal that opens where you're like, this feels different. And so, that's like that meditative experiential realm where you're just kind of like, it feels like it's alive to me. I don't have any proof of that, but certainly when you get into the interesting, like, physics geeking out, where you're just like, that seems to be where the conversation's going, where you're like, well, everything, is actually made up of, these pulses and waves that flow in and out of each other, and lots of things that we think of as solid are not. And even with consciousness studies, what I'm by no means an expert in this, it seems like there's a lot of conversation around consciousness may be this thing that is on a scientific level, actually, like, it's not like there are conscious and non-conscious things. There are just things that are more conscious or have more measurable consciousness. So I'm fascinated by that. I don't claim to understand it on a scientific level or an experiential level, but I feel like the way that meditation practice has opened me up, when it seems to be like working in the sense of like, I feel so happy and so connected with everything. That's when the world and inanimate objects, and certainly the ocean, which is alive, it feels that way. It feels like, wow, this is all, it sounds cliche, just it's all connected and I'm flowing into it somehow. And then to take that to the kind of indigenous level, where then these, out there in nature, there are sort of beings, that you might interact with. I guess I don't know what's going on with that. I just leave it open to possibility. And I think I don't know if that's just the way humans read energies, and we have to put it in a way, in a terminology. We have to put it in a picture and label it, or if there's something like, physical about that, is that's part of the mystery. But I think it's cool. I like to talk about it and think about it.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to hear what you're learning about it, because I don't feel that knowledgeable about the different traditions.
Yeah, I mean, well, just in terms of the limitations of the view of scientific, materialism, which, the cool thing about Buddhism is, because it's had, this incredibly rich history of 2,500 years and has gone through all of these philosophical iterations. I mean, in a lot of different ways, its development and playing off of Vedic thought and other, Taoism and other Eastern thoughts kind of being hammered out and enriched over, centuries and thousands of years, had a lot of the philosophical discussions in kind of more experiential and contemplative forms, that Western philosophy kind of just got to in the last century without the contemplative processes to actually integrate into experience. You can kind of tell which way I'm biased, although, I like a few French post-structuralists and so forth, but I don't think any of them are figuring out anything that Nagarjuna didn't know, and he's also teaching you how to meditate at the same time. And so this notion of materialism, which is basically the view that things are just matter, they're biological processes, right? So even from the sheer standpoint of scientific materialism, we're not even alive. We are just kind of chemically induced to feel conscious, and it's sort of an accident of the universe. And then, it has certain rules that the organism can pursue pleasure or avoid, displeasure. And then at a certain point, it falls apart and just kind of goes back to matter, and I really like Robin Wall Kimmerer's work in Braiding Sweetgrass, because she also unites science with a view, like a more animistic view of nature. She talks more about, Native American life in upstate New York and so forth. But so it's not really as much about, the ocean, but she's uniting an animistic view with a kind of origin stories about the world that you're right. Like sometimes we do need to conceptualize things and kind of anthropomorphize them, like, to give like the ocean a spirit name, rather than just letting it be this beautiful field of living energy, which would probably be more, the Buddhist approach would probably be, let's not anthropomorphize it, but let's view it as alive, kind of non-conceptually, right? But it's just fascinating because this view of like the world is just dead matter and we are dead matter is obviously linked into our, environmental devastation, probably our inability to enjoy being in an interdependent relationship with nature, which, my sense of being in the ocean as a swimmer is that is one of the places you just naturally feel the interdependence of, that humanity is of the ocean, exactly as you're saying, like the whole world is of the ocean, so it's just interesting how our philosophical view and our formative narratives, that's something she talks about a lot, kind of shape our understanding of what's actually going on, so.
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there. Yeah, I'm definitely lean toward the view that our sort of assumption, our materialist assumptions, or materialist dogma sort of right now leads us to the environmental degradation. But because I think it's such a depressing worldview, I mean, there's some, if all you are is like a sack of DNA, that I think you kind of got to just take advantage of any fleeting pleasure that you can and try to accrue material things, because and I think that it's funny how much we assume as lay people who are like just dabble, or a lot of, I think, people assume materialism is like the logical view when or like the scientific one, when it seems like all I guess when I reason my way through like, well, or it's, I guess it would seem like science is pointing us toward just not knowing when it comes down to consciousness studies of like, where does consciousness arrive? We don't know, but it's like then to leap toward, well, it's just a sort of a chemical response. When there's all this, I'm reading this book right now. I don't know if you've read it, called Erasing Death. It's by a Stony Brook resuscitation doctor. He's the chief of resuscitation at Stony Brook Hospital. And, he's basically recorded all this data of, how, people's experiences after they flatline and come back. So they're biologically dead, they're brain dead. Some of them are dead for, over an hour, and come back. And there's so many experiences of the person then reporting back while they were dead what the doctors were doing to them while they were dead.
Wow.
And he's finally like cataloging it, the data. And so at least to leap to the conclusion that we don't understand consciousness, just like we can't conclude where consciousness comes from, seems to be like the logical thing to do. And then, but to also put a little more, I guess, research and funding into figuring out like, well, where, if consciousness isn't just a biological process, or maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I'm always amazed like how it seems like the intelligent thing to do to just assume that consciousness is of the brain. And if you assume otherwise, you're on some like spiritual trip where the evidence is, isn't conclusive really in any one direction on a scientific level. And then if you take people's experiential studies, like from Buddhism or from, so many of the different philosophical traditions, I think it leans much more toward something more where consciousness is sort of there in the universe, and is connecting life, and we don't quite understand how sort of the ego forms around consciousness. Like that's more the mystery to me. When I think about it. Anyway, we're getting far afield here, but
yeah,
into realms I don't understand. But I think it's a fascinating place to read and study about. And I'm glad that some of the indigenous and ancient traditions are sort of coalescing or crossing paths with science right now, with really true open-minded science. I think it's cool.
Yeah. So I want to leave time to talk about the writing and work you've been doing in more recent years, because you're a father. You have 3 boys, which is crazy to me. I only have 1 girl, and boys are scary to me. No, I'm kidding. But I have a signed copy, which I read with my daughter, of the first of your children's book series, Mop Rides the Waves of Life. About a surfing boy who also is trying to learn to work with difficult emotions and mental experiences. And more recently, you've written the first in a series of graphic novels, City of Dragons. So I'm just wondering, this sort of shift or pivot into writing for younger people, for kids and adolescents. Like, how did you get there? Was it thinking? I often get told, what are good, sort of dharmic stuff for kids, or parents with kids. Like, was it feeling like there wasn't enough good, like, children's books from a mindfulness perspective, or?
No, it wasn't that, because actually I feel like children's books kind of get more Dharma without being Dharma books than adult books, because you're in this wonderful, wholesome place where it's about like, hey, let's teach each other to be kind and share. And like, I think I liked that world. It was one that I was reintroduced to when I became a dad, and was like, gosh, there's so much good stuff. And actually, though, making stories in that way that you do when you're a kid, where you just start drawing and then you write some words underneath the picture, was like how I love telling stories. And even before I became an author, I remember doing a few children's books just for fun. And so when it was one of those things that just leapt spontaneously out. Like when I became a dad, I was really excited to meet our first child, and he was late. And I remember in that 2-week period where he should have been there, but we were like, is he going to come any day? I had taken some time off work, and I went down to this hotel that has this beautiful view of the ocean, got some pancakes. I remember just scribbling out this children's story to him. And it was meant just for him, but I felt this huge upwelling of joy. And I hadn't felt it from writing. I think writing, I was a journalist, and then had been doing these grown-up books like Saltwater Buddha and All Our Waves of Water and The Fear Project. And that world is so much of like a math problem. And also it feels so much like so competitive. Like you're trying to show off how smart you are to other adults. You're trying to show off how good of a writer you are. And you have to get through this gauntlet of like the publisher's weekly review. If you don't get the good one, then your book is like dead. And, just that all exists in children's books. But for this one, I was writing it for my son. And I just felt this joy. And I was like, this is why I create stories. This is why I write. And that book, I ended up self-publishing because I liked it. I did all the illustrations while he was like rocking in the swing and we're trying to get him to sleep. I stayed up making these little watercolors. And from that on, I was just like, I want to do this. I want this joy in my life I want this to come back around the creative process. Not that I hadn't felt it writing Saltwater Buddha and stuff, but it felt really like, I don't know, just unhindered childhood joy. And I was like, I want this. And MOP kind of arose that way too, where he actually got the idea just by doodling. I love doodling, this little curly haired surfer. And then that first story kind of flowed out of my doodles. And I was able to somehow avoid the usual publishing torture where I just sent it like the scribbled story to Parallax Press, one of our great Buddhist presses. And they were like, we love this. And then we just started working together. So there was a flow and a joy around it that I've just been kind of following.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it is a beautiful kind of, again, it has all these elements of riding the waves and, working with feelings and difficult feelings. So it's a really nice sort of way of getting somebody to look at their internal kind of experience, right? So that's an interesting question, is like, when can kids start actually becoming aware of like, I am feeling something, I am thinking something,
I think young, I've seen a lot of, and each actually even more from other kids who've read Mop than my own. I think my kids kind of like don't use the wave metaphor down. But
shut up about waves.
Don't go there. but I get notes from 4 and 5-year-old parents saying, here's every time. I think a lot of kids are turning it around on their parents. They're going like, you're in a gnarly wave, Dad. Like, you're getting real angry. Like, breathe and let it go by. But they're at least noticing that one can find distance from one's own emotion, and reflect on it. So,
yeah. And then, so it's interesting. I mean, I have my favorite like dharmic content. I would say I watched it as a grown up because it was so good before I had kids. But do you have any like Dharma for like content? Like the one that I always think about is Avatar: The Last Airbender. That series is like because it's not boring. It's not just about meditating the whole time, but just in terms of incorporating all these conversations of mindfulness and working with the elements and ethics, etc. Like do you have anything that you thought of as like, this is my favorite Dharma for kids sort of situation before you started?
That is a really good one. That's a great question. I think before, I do really, one of the ones we came back to a lot was the Perfect Piggy meditation books.
Oh yeah, I've heard of
I'm like, a little younger than Avatar, but when they were like 3, and I think those are great. I love how the piggy introduces, like there's one scene where, the piggy loses its goldfish and the goldfish is dead. And I kind of love that the writer didn't shy away from that in a children's book of it's like, but those were great. And I think fantasy though, like reading I can't get my kids into the Tolkien books yet, but Tolkien was a huge like Dharma door for me. Mm-hmm. And I think the other sort of fantasy series, in the sense that meditation to me feels like a kind of portal where out of the materialistic cage, where it's like the world is a little more malleable and dream and reality are a little bit closer. So, and for me as a kid, like books like The Phantom Tollbooth and the Narnia series were kind of that felt similar. And so really, I don't know if my kids feel that, but at least when I'm reading those books with them, I sort of, I'm getting some of that. I think it's why I was so excited to do a first fantasy series, City of Dragons, because I think it's like, as a kid, those places of wonder where you're like in awe, you're in a place of wonder, really felt very close to me, to a mind that I was trying to get back to as an adult through meditation.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, oh, this is kind of a natural place where my mind feels big, and so anyway,
that's a really interesting
I have
point.
to do Avatar with my kids. Everybody's been saying to watch that. I haven't watched the new series that I hear is great. Have you done the new animated version of Avatar?
The follow-up series, The Legend of Korra, which is about the next Avatar. Yeah, I watched that. I still think Avatar: The Last Airbender is gets an A, and probably the new series gets like a B+ in my in my Buddhist cartoon critic. But it's definitely, if you like the first series, it modernizes the world. It takes place like 75 or 80 years later. Yeah, I mean, it's that's a really interesting point, that this notion of fantasy and kind of wonderment, right? Because a lot of people think about meditation as sort of narrowing the mind down into concentration. And so this idea that it's actually about curiosity, that it actually can open your imagination, that you could write fantasy from a mindfulness standpoint, right? So you could write about a magical world, So yeah, where did the idea for City of Dragons come from? Was it just from Big Mind, or did you have a specific influence?
It was. It actually did come to me when I was up at. One of my Dharma homes is the City of 10,000 Buddhas in Ukiah, California. It's a big Chinese Buddhist monastery, and where I almost ordained, actually, I was right after high school. I lived in one of their branch monasteries for a year and was pretty serious about becoming a monk. And I still go there sometimes. And there's a lot of, in the Chinese Buddhist tradition, dragons are a big part of they're in the sutras, and they and so dragons were kind of talked about around this monastery, just like they were real. And I mean, you can take your pick of how you approach that. Sort of, is it sort of like, are they being used as a metaphor or a nature energy? I mean, in the East, dragons are usually thought of as sort of like these benevolent water-bringing creatures. And then Buddhism sort of, I think, took that benevolence and made it part of the mythology and the storytelling. But yeah, when I was there, I had been wanting to do a fantasy novel, and I think and really hearkening back to missing some of the stories from our childhood, like the Goonies and Ghostbusters, like stories that were like, they felt like they opened up a magical world, but they were just so funny and entertaining, and they were for the whole family. But they also weren't like Disney movies like Encanto or Luca, where it's like for little kids. They're also for grownups. And so anyway, I was trying to come up with a story, and I just, while I was meditating on this retreat, it was first retreat in a long time, this idea for a girl finding a dragon egg popped into my head. At school, because I thought it'd be fun to have a crew around, like, what do we do with this dragon? and have it sort of then be that's their portal instead. And a lot of the fantasy books that I had read were about going into another world. And I thought it would be cool if the dragon would be in this world, because I think a lot of my practice has been about finding magic in the mundane. Like when you're in a mindful, open place, it's like you can be walking down the street and just like the sparkles on the sidewalk or something feel so beautiful, or, that place where you're really appreciative, you're in an appreciative mindset. And I think I liked the idea of like magic in our world, because I think, and obviously it's not mundane. They have a real dragon these kids have found, but there is something that's tied to mindfulness in that story, even though it's not explicit there. But yeah, I mean, I love to riff on the Tibetan meditation and creativity, because one of the things I was sort of really brought up in Chan and Zen, but then I went and lived in India for during college, and I became really good friends with a Tibetan monk. And one of the things that struck me about is he would always say, "Oh, we go see like a big lama or something." He'd say, "Oh, this lama, many colorful, many like big colorful mind." And like my idea, and I think so many people's is like, if you have a clear meditation, like it's like crystal, Mm-hmm. His was more like a meditation, like a Tonka painting, Yeah. And I think there's something so fascinating about the creation space of like tantric Buddhism, and just how it's not my daily practice, but I've experimented with it, and I think it really breaks open the what is possible in meditation. Shows. So I don't know as nearly as much about it as you, but I think there's something interesting there in terms of like creativity and meditation.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's a very rich iconographic system, right? So, I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right that it's, if for example, I mean, I'm more familiar with Soto and Rinzai Zen from a practice standpoint, but if that was kind of like a crystal clear, crystal sort of like black and white calligraphy drawing, then yeah, Tibetan Buddhism is like, full, rich color kind of, even attaining awakening in Tibetan Buddhism is often referred to as attaining the rainbow body, right? Okay. And each of these primal colors represents a different core emotion in its awakened state. So it's a very rich, colorful, iconographic tradition. So yeah, it seems like you are definitely in terms of imagination, right? That your work definitely has that kind of rich, colorful, but I think sometimes people, even who are incredibly creative, like I had Ruth Ozeki, the great novelist who's she's a Japanese Zen student and priest and great novelist. So, I think her main meditation practice is pretty straightforward, Zazen, sort of simple practice, but her mind is incredibly colorful, which seems sort of similar. You've written all these different genres, you've, produced documentaries, so you're thinking in multimedia, even if your practice is more Chan or Zen based. So it's interesting. Sometimes our practice simplicity, I think, opens us up to a much richer post-meditation experience. Maybe that's part of it too.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the mind is a wild, colorful place. And I think it's interesting where those two interact, like the sort of field that, this is a distant memory for me as a dad, because I haven't gone on long retreat really since becoming a dad. I managed a day or two here and there, but I used to go on these, 10 days and stuff. And I remember often on those 8th or 9th day where your mind is becoming your meditations are getting really quiet, and your breath is really still, and there being a kind of almost like the ocean is really flat and peaceful on top, and almost like that world gets turned upside down, and there would be like this wild vision or something, or dreamlike kind of state that would arise, where all of a sudden I'd be like feeling like I was seeing, a little bit on like the psychedelic realm where you're getting these visions of oceans or dolphins or animals or where it was like a more a more like dreamlike kind of colorful thinking. And I think that's just the cool thing about meditation is there are so many layers to the mind, and that we don't understand. And when you're trying, going back to sort of our talk about materialism, when you're going at it from this sort of Western standpoint where it's like, well, we're just going to do talk therapy and sort of try to get at what the mind is through thinking about our own thoughts. It's so limited because the mind is this really vast ocean. And so I think, anyway, to segue back to our discussion of creativity, I think that for anybody who's listening who is wanting to access their creativity, I would just say that it's reliable, that, you can count your mindfulness as part of your work because it's like, if I really feel writer's block or feel really stunted or feel kind of dead in my creative process, I know for sure if I take a day and go meditate in the woods or something, that aliveness is down there, that colorfulness and it's unpredictable, sort of what is going to come out, what ideas will spark. And I think, so it makes sense to me that hearing that author you're referring to, when you're just sort of letting the mind still, it can produce, wild ideas. Not that that's the point of meditation to come up with wild ideas, but that, it can be a rich field, I think, for the creative.
Well, this has been an awesome discussion, Jaimal. I want to just for people who don't know how your name is spelled, just so they can look up your books and you're on social media. So it's Jaimal Yogis, and at Jaimal Yogis is your Instagram handle. And is that your website as well?
I don't have a website anymore, but just social media is kind of the way that I internet.
You can say I'm post website.
Yeah. Right.
But City of Dragons is the graphic novel. If you're a parent, Mop Rides the Waves of Life is a great one. And if you want to check out his earlier work for big kids or grownups, Saltwater Buddha, The Fear Project, and I just had the third one in front of me. Wait, I'm getting too old.
All Our Waves Are Water.
All Waves Are Water. That's right. Okay. Well, I hope we can have you back on the podcast sometime, and when we're on the same coast, hang out. And maybe you can teach me a thing or two about surfing.
I got a board here ready for you, Ethan. Yeah, come out.
Okay.
Come out to the west. All right, it's such a pleasure. Yeah, thanks. I really enjoy what you do. So thanks. Keep on keeping on.
Thanks so much, Jaimal. So for the Road Home podcast, this is Ethan Nichtern, and we'll see you next time.